I'm Jessica Dean. I teach English here at Western, and I came here 2 years ago from Tennessee, where I also taught English at a community college in Knoxville, Tennessee. So last semester, Stacy plans these really far in advance, and she said, hey, January is Poverty Awareness Month in America. Will you give a colloquium on that? And I was like, sure. I am really interested in this topic, something I focus on in lots of areas of my life. So over the winter break, I did a draft of this, my draft outline, and it was about 2.5 hours long of a presentation. And so I cut it, don't worry, and I'm gonna keep this noon version on Mondays has to be pretty tight to get everybody to class. Wednesday, if you ever come to a Wednesday night one, we have more time for discussion and stuff afterwards. It's not filmed, and it's a little bit more relaxed there, but I did cut it, and one of my English teachers used to tell me, Jessica, you're on an interstate, and this paper, it's like you want to travel across the whole country, but you have to pick one destination, and you've got to take an exit ramp. So that's what I tried to do here, and I make no representation that I know everything about poverty. One of the problems with discussing this is that poverty is seen as this monolithic, singular thing. Like everybody who experiences poverty in some form has the same problems, the same experiences, all of that. So I make no representation that me up here, I represent the ultimate truth about poverty. So my goal today, since it's Poverty Awareness Month, is to try and hopefully help you leave here more aware about a couple of things. One, since last week was Dr. Martin Luther King Day, last Monday we didn't have classes, and this week begins Black History Month, I thought it would be interesting to look at Dr. King's perspectives on poverty and economics. And then also kind of look at where we are today with some of that. So my hope is that you'll be more aware of either historical context of poverty or current conversations around poverty in America in particular. So that's where I hope to go. Now the title, Beyond Ramen, there's a little meme for you. Where did that come from? Okay, so last week Western made the newspaper for lots of things. We made it for wrestling, and both signing new athletes and other athletes signing on to University of Nebraska, I think. One of my former students is going there, really exciting. We also made the paper because students here on our campus have decided that it's really important to address the issue that there are a lot of students that can't afford enough to eat. And so students have organized, and I've helped them on the side, giving them some advice. Alex Nelson, Student Life, has led the project with the students and SGA, but they're opening a food pantry. So they sent out a press release letting everybody know it's going to open tomorrow. And all 3 local news outlets picked it up. Here's what the Rocket Miner ran. If you don't send an image with your press release, the news just picks one. The news outlet picks one. So they chose, what did they choose? What image did they put with this? The Western logo, okay? Interesting. So YO4 News chose this photo. What does that say to you? What's the mood of that photo? Sad. What else? Depressed. Huh? Depressing, depressed, sad. Okay? And Sweet Butter Now picked plain raw ramen noodles. And I'd already chosen my title for this months ago. And where did this title come from? Because I hope that this conversation today enables you to elevate your conversation beyond the ramen noodle joke about poverty in America. There's this constant joke about, oh, you're poor and in college, you can't afford food, well, just eat ramen 4 times a day or whatever. Or, oh, like your family doesn't have food, like just buy the big pack of ramen. Oh, I'm just gonna survive off ramen. And it's a big joke. There are tons of memes about it. It's an accepted joke. And if you get down to the core of it, it's like not really funny, to me at least. I'm kind of over it. So I wanted you to be able to elevate your knowledge beyond this joke of like, well, we just associate poverty with ramen. Or you're poor, I'll just donate a bunch of ramen to the food pantry. We're grateful for any donations, but like I'm hoping people like get the message that like, yeah, that's what college students are already eating, and so we'd love to get some other things that maybe they can't afford beyond ramen. So that's where the title comes from. And this happened last week, and I was like, yes, they just did it, because I can use it in my presentation now. We're grateful for all this coverage, and the community's responded really awesome to this pantry. Like, we got lots of donations last week, which is so amazing. These photos reflect what people associate with food insecurity and poverty. Shame, stigma, depression, isolation, alone, ramen. Okay? So I like to involve you a little bit in our conversation. So if you have your cell phone out, I do want you to use it for a second, and then I'll have you put it back up. So if you can go to this website, zeetings.com/wild geese, and if you're watching online, you can also go to this. And it's just a quick survey. It's totally anonymous. Your name, nothing will pop up. It just will give you some data. There should be one question live when you go to that website. So I'm just curious, this is just a warm-up question, then I have another one for you. Who's in the room today? So if you select it, I'll be able, so are you a first-year success student? Are you here because you're a student, you're not in first-year success? Are you an employee? Are you someone that lives in the area? So now I can kind of see who my audience is. So most of y'all are first-year success, or a couple of employees, and a student or two that are here for a different class. Okay, so now this next question is a little bit more direct, and we're getting these perceptions, right? Which of these issues do you most associate with the mission of Dr. Martin Luther King? Do you associate him with dealing with the issue of racism? Do you associate him dealing with the issues of poverty or militarism? Which of these do you most associate Dr. King with? % of you said you associate Dr. King with dealing with the issue of racism, okay? Yeah, he was a leader in the civil rights movement. And I find this with most students. I'm asking my classes, some of them, to study a whole speech of his right now. Not as I Have a Dream speech, but a different speech. And students are often struck by how much he talks about economics and war and militarism alongside issues of race, okay? So rank these in the order you may have heard some other stuff, but rank these in the order that you think they were important to him. And you can kind of drag these around. Zeetings, what I'm using right now, is a free online website that you can just sign in with your Google account and create surveys. So if you're giving a class presentation or a speech, this is a fun tool to have because anybody with a phone can use it, and it's totally free for you to do it. So it's a pretty cool tool. The librarian here taught me how to use this. Okay, so racism, economic, racism, militarism. Okay, so thank you for that. So we're gonna get into this a little bit more. So I want to give you just a little bit of background on me because I think that's important when talking about like money, and your experience with it is like a really personal thing, and I want to represent myself. I'm not an authority on the topic of poverty, but just to give you a little glimpse of what my life was like, and it is like and has been like. This is me growing up in Kentucky. I don't have any memories of being, quote, poor. But we definitely, like I asked my parents getting ready for this, I was like, what was the deal? Like, I don't remember not having enough food, but I do remember we ate a lot of macaroni and cheese and a lot of Chef Boyardee, but I don't remember not ever having something. And they're like, yeah, I mean, we were never rich, but we didn't have extra, you know? And we didn't have a lot of stuff. I always grew up in rural areas in Kentucky, Vermont, and Georgia. I'd never been shopping at a mall until we moved to Georgia when I was like 9 years old. I'd only been to thrift stores in Vermont because it was like a rural community. So sometimes there's this conflation of rural and poverty, and just because you don't have a lot, could you not afford it, or was that where you lived? There's a little bit of that going on. But we did have to move to Georgia so my dad could get a job and support us because they couldn't afford to live in Vermont anymore with the work that was available there and the cost of living. But, you know, in talking to my dad about things, this is my great-grandparents, my dad's grandparents, and they were tobacco farmers in Kentucky. So, my dad said, you know what? They never would have said, we're poor. But they were dirt poor. Literally, the phrase dirt poor, like they're living off the dirt, okay? And my dad said, you know, they didn't know that until the government actually came and said, y'all know you're poor and you qualify for assistance. In like the 70s and the 80s, once the tobacco market had changed completely. You can see on the wallpaper back there, there's this shiny plastic covering. Any guesses what's going on there? Why'd they cover the wallpaper with plastic? Preserve it from they didn't want the cigarette smoke. Everybody smoked inside. So there was this, like, the wallpaper was really fancy. This was like in the late 80s, like they pretty much retired. My dad grew the last crop of tobacco around 1964, he said. And he said the price of tobacco for the 10 years prior to that never changed. It was $1.89 a bushel. And that's when they kind of knew they weren't going to be able to do that anymore. When we talk about poverty, we're going to look at the political and economic structures that influence some of this stuff, right? They had been able to work as subsistence farmers in Kentucky for a long time. And the global economy changed that for them. And my dad knew this was not going to be a viable career. His dad had already gotten out and was working for a corporation, a business. And so my dad was the last one that grew the last crop on that farm. And eventually they start getting subsidies from the government because the thing that they were able to provide food and shelter on, that they were like, we're not poor, we've got food and shelter. And they worked really hard all year long. My dad said, I mean, you started, as soon as that garden started, like every single thing you did was so you could survive the next year over the winter. Like, they both worked really hard to create build their own house, to raise all their own food pretty much. And by the 70s and 80s, that wasn't a viable option anymore. So we've got to think about how our society and culture has changed from kind of a more agrarian society to a more urban society, more consumer-driven society rather than producing. So that's just a little bit of background on my family. I do want to make one note about privilege, though. And this is a conversation that's uncomfortable for a lot of reasons. So if you can just stick with me for a second. I'm white, okay? And my family, although they are not wealthy, has been able to accumulate wealth over several generations. In any conversation of poverty, you have to look at the reasons why they had some privileges and that I have inherited those privileges. Number one, my grandparents being white and having a male in the family, he was able to get a loan from a bank legally and buy land. My great-grandmother could not have done that. She could not have gone to the bank and gotten a loan to buy land. Okay? If their skin color was different, they couldn't have done that in Kentucky. Okay? They were able to start a business on their land. Native Americans in this country, dislocated from their land, put onto reservations, they don't own the reservation land. To become a farmer on a reservation, you have to get dozens and dozens of approvals from the federal government. You can't just start a farm and sell vegetables. It's not your land. They could do that. So you have to think about privilege in this conversation too, and who has it, and why did they have it, and how did it accumulate. So even though we aren't rich, we got a little something more each year. Each generation built a little bit more. So we did have a head start, and that's what privilege is about. So even though I'm white and I've never been wealthy, I still have had some privilege, and that's a big part of this economic poverty discussion. So here's a little bit of disclosure on my background too. I made a little graph for y'all. This is when I graduated college in 2003. I started working at a bank, and so I had half a year of making salary there. But my real salary at the bank was about $43,000 in 2003. And so what you can see here is my income. So it's like $20,000, $40,000, $60,000. Went steadily up as I worked for the bank, and then 2008 recession happened. I left right before that. And I went to work for a nonprofit, and I was like an administrator there, like a secretary. And I managed some stuff. But I took a big pay cut to do that. And then I decided to go back to grad school because I wanted to be a teacher. So that's what happens here. And this is me all in grad school, and then after grad school, waiting on a full-time job. And this is me when I got to Wyoming, all the way at the end. So I'm back at about the level I started with in 2003. Now, the yellow line is how many jobs I had each year. And that's by tens over here to scale. So this year I had 2 jobs. Then I got down to 1 job. And then as I had to take, I was in school, so I couldn't work full-time. And I had to, look how many, I had up to 6 jobs in 1 year. But look how low my income is then, right? And we see this a lot. When you have to take part-time jobs because you're trying to get to the next phase, you take so many jobs because you can only get 10 hours or 15 hours or whatever. And so you can see some of my lowest levels of income are when I had the most number of jobs. And this is the federal poverty line. The federal government has set, this means you're at poverty level. So this is from 2003 up to 2020, what the number is. And we'll look at the numbers in a second. One of my 6 jobs at my peak, I was giving out samples of pimento cheese at the grocery store. This was an introvert's nightmare job, but it paid really well. It paid $20 an hour. And I just go and do it for 4 hours, pack my stuff up and go, and it was really hard just because it totally took me on my shell, but I had to do it. And it was over winter break. So I was tutoring during the school year, but over winter break, nobody needs their kids tutored, so I'll go hand out samples of pimento cheese. So I learned a lot when I had those 6 jobs at once. So I want you to listen to Dr. King directly for a second and hear some of what he says about his views on economic justice.
The last 2 months of his life, Dr. King faced the idea that civil rights alone could not solve the problem of poverty. He roamed the South, trying to gain support for Poor People's Campaign. Its goals: full employment, a guaranteed income, and decent housing for every American.
The campaign would recruit among all races, bring them to Washington, force the government to respond, a nonviolent army of the poor.
All working together to solve the problem of poverty. We are tired of working full-time jobs for part-time income, and we are tired of not being able to find work. And it didn't cost the nation 1 penny to integrate lunch counters. It didn't cost the nation 1 penny to guarantee the right to vote. Now we are dealing nation can spend $35 billion a year to fight an unjust, evil war in Vietnam, and $20 billion to put a man on the moon, it can spend billions of dollars to put God's children on their own 2 feet right here on earth. This is a reality. Now, when we come to Washington, we are coming to get our check. Very frankly, this is a search for an alternative to riot. The riot is the language of the unheard. And what is it that America has failed to hear? It has failed to hear that the promises of freedom and justice have not been met. All we say to America is be true to what you said on paper. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But if a man doesn't have a job or an income, he has neither life nor liberty and the possibility for the pursuit of happiness. He merely exists. We are demanding an emergency program to provide employment for everyone in need of a job, or if a work program is impractical, a guaranteed annual income at levels that sustain life in decent circumstances. This is a new beginning on the economic front.
The Poor People's Campaign was about economics. And what happened to that whole movement? It's almost as if it wasn't, it disappeared.
Wait a minute. It didn't disappear. You might forget Martin Luther King was assassinated in April. The Poor People's Campaign was supposed to go to Washington in April. So the organization that mobilized it was essentially decapitated and thrown into chaos about 3 weeks before it was supposed to happen.
All right, so that was King, kind of a compilation of him in his own words. After the Civil Rights Act was passed, he really shifted his focus on poverty and unifying lots of races and saying, okay, we got the Civil Rights Act passed, the playing field's a little bit more level, but this poverty thing affects all of the lower class. So he identified the 3 evils as racism, poverty, and war. He started the Poor People's Campaign, which was supposed to begin in April, May 1968. They were supposed to march on Washington and camp there until things changed. But he was assassinated a few weeks before that happened. He demanded economic and human rights for all people. It was a multiracial effort. The main asks were guaranteed basic income and affordable housing. So the context of this is President Johnson's war on poverty, which, remember I said my great-grandparents, about the 1960s, things changed. They couldn't make it on the farm anymore. And someone showed up and said, you know you're poor and qualify for this. And they were like, what? But yeah, that was actually an initiative by the government. So 1960 census estimated 22 to 33% of Americans were living in poverty. But towards the end of the 60s, remember around 1968, Vietnam's really cranking up. They need a lot of funding to go there. And so they start cutting the poverty programs to put it towards the military budget. And King, a lot of his sermons and speeches talk about all this stuff around that time. His solutions were, he proposed economic withdrawal. So boycott companies that are not fair in their hiring practices or wages. A famous boycott they did was with Seal Test Milk, Seal Test Dairies. In Tennessee, they weren't hiring, I think it was Tennessee, they weren't hiring African Americans and they weren't paying fair wages. So they encouraged a huge boycott of their products, and it happened quick. And they realized quickly that it was going to be a problem, so they changed, and they agreed to meet with them. He also wanted to create or strengthen minority-owned banking systems and businesses. So I need to take a minute to talk about this idea that it's interesting because back then, a lot of what's thrown out was, well, King's a communist. This whole movement's communism, to scare people. And it's very interesting because this still happens today. It's a red herring. Oh gosh, they're all communists or whatever. So I just encourage you, whenever you hear that today, even that you do a little more investigation. And it baffles me that this was such a thing with King, because this is him. They said he was at a communist training school in Tennessee. He actually, even in the 1950s, he has a sermon called Communism's Challenge to Christianity. And he comes out and he says, no true Christian can even support communism at all. I don't support it. It's super problematic. But we should be able to learn something from it. So this whole sermon is saying all the problems with communism and why he doesn't agree with it. But like any critical thinker, and this is hopefully what y'all are working on in college, you're like, you know what, we can still learn something from this. There's very few things that are purely evil or purely good. So he said, it's to challenge us to be more concerned about social justice. However much is wrong with communism, we must admit that it arose as a protest against the hardship for the underprivileged. He has so many things, a whole chapter in a book where he's like, I'm not a communist, here's why. But the FBI still investigated him for communist activity. And they use this photo as proof. This is at Highlander in Grundy County, Tennessee. I've been to Highlander. I've brought classes on field trips there. So that's Dr. King. Do y'all recognize anybody else in that photo? It's a little grainy, but I'll give you a hint. Y'all know who that is? Rosa Parks. That's Rosa Parks right here. This is in 1957. This is an FBI photo. The FBI was going undercover at Highlander. Highlander was a place way out in the country where people got together to talk about civil rights. In the 30s, people got together at Highlander to talk about coal mining in Appalachia and how to get coal miners good work conditions and fair wages. And so they were big into labor unions with the coal mines, and then they kind of just became like a teaching, learning, sharing center. And during the civil rights movement, it was a safe place for white folks and black folks to get together and talk about what could be done. But a lot of people saw it as a communist training center, which it wasn't. So that's actually Pete Seeger up there too, the musician, and Ralph Abernathy. So the FBI investigated King. This is a letter that J. Edgar Hoover actually wrote, making it sound like it wasn't him, and sent it to King, threatening his life. We know all this now. And the Senate actually investigated King after he died and said there was no evidence of communist activity. So I think it's important just to acknowledge that, because some people would argue with you about it, but there's plenty of proof that that wasn't the case. So King talked a lot about the structural conditions of poverty and the mindset of poverty, these two things, so we're going to talk about that now. I've tried to do some listening on this topic. So I did a little Instagram poll, and some of my former students responded, friends, people from all over the country. They said, if you've experienced poverty, what do you wish people knew? What do you wish people knew about it that you feel like they don't? This is somewhat they said. It doesn't equate to ignorance or lack of curiosity or ambition. That it's part of the whole system. That it's not evidence of a moral failing or a character flaw, it's evidence of a capitalism flaw. So we want to validate different experiences of poverty. Here's what King said. We must ask the question, why are there 40 million poor people in America? And you begin to ask the question, you're raising questions about the economic system, about a broader distribution of wealth. When you ask that question, you begin to question the capitalistic economy. And I'm simply saying that more and more we've got to begin to ask questions about the whole society. So you might hear in conversations today, a living wage, the minimum wage, and a poverty wage. These are things that are thrown out a lot, okay? So the United States government sets a poverty threshold every year, and this is the current threshold for 2018 income. If you're living alone and you make $13,064 or less, you're considered in poverty. Okay? So when people say people are in poverty, there's actual hard number about that. 2 adults, that's the number, 1 adult, 1 child. MIT has come up with a living wage calculator that's interesting to play around with. You can pull it up for different states, different cities in particular, but Wyoming, they only have this whole state of Wyoming. They don't have particular cities. So here's what they estimate you need to make to be able to survive in Wyoming. A living wage to afford basic needs. If you have 0 children, you need a minimum of $11.10 an hour. The poverty wage would be $5.84, and the minimum wage currently in Wyoming is $7.25. And you can kind of see this goes across the chart for different things. And here's how they estimated typical expenses for one adult, you know, different numbers of children, childcare, medical, housing. And I've looked at this for a couple different cities, and I kind of think it's actually low for a couple cities I've lived in personally. So it's interesting for you to look at that yourself and see where you fall in there. And compare that to the actual federal poverty levels. So one person living alone, $13,064, that's what the government considers in poverty. But in Wyoming, one person living alone, the income you need to survive, just these basic stuff, is $23,000 estimated. So right now there's a big gap between what's considered poverty, and then so that gives you access to some resources, and what you actually need to live. So when you hear people talk about this, it's important to keep that in mind. And a living wage is what is estimated you need per hour to actually be able to afford these basic living expenses. So some more things people wish they knew about poverty. These are folks that have experienced poverty that said, hey, I wish other people knew this. It's not a choice. I would love to choose to get out of this. It's not just like I choose it every day for myself. They wish people understood how expensive it is to be poor or broke for a long time. And they wish people understood that it might be for a season or two, but it doesn't define me as a person. Have some compassion, okay? Sometimes the discussions on poverty get real, just unkind. And King saw dignity in all work. And I think that's the connection between these thoughts and his thoughts. If you're going to be a street sweeper, do it well, do it beautifully. When King died in Memphis in 1968, he was there to support sanitation workers that were striking for better conditions. Garbage folks. Can you imagine if we didn't have that service? What an important thing. I know there's controversy about how good it is in Green River. I live over there. People get real upset about the sanitation service not doing their job. But there's dignity in all work. So I think, to me, this raises the question of who decides what hourly rate some job is? When did it become undignified or unworthy to feed people? To be like, oh, you're going to be flipping burgers and you only deserve this amount because you flip burgers. What if we looked at it as like, wow, you're actually like feeding people and providing a critical service? So how do we assign value to these? Do CEOs actually work harder and longer? Do they have more skills than someone growing food for someone else? Or welding? You know, who works hard? Like, what is hard work and how do we value that? Who put where did these numbers come from today? It's expensive to be poor. Money is more expensive when you're poor. That sounds crazy, right? But it's more expensive when you're poor. Banking, overdraft or low balance fees. I worked in the banking industry for the first 3 years of my career, and I can tell you that they make a ton of money off of overdraft fees. Ton. You are charged higher interest rates. If you have a lower credit score, because your family history or your own history, you actually have less access to funding. So if you have really high credit score and like some cash in the bank, you want to start your own business, right? Like you really want to like try. You go to the bank, I'm going to start my own business, I have this good idea. Oh, well, it's going to cost you 3 times more to start your business because you're poor than this person over here who's already got some capital. Money is literally more expensive when you're poor, okay? Your health suffers when you're poor. If y'all have ever had an hourly job, you know. If you get sick for a week, right, you don't get paid. You don't. And so if you're due to illness on your own part, or childbirth, or taking care of other people, like your paycheck's lower. Stress, there's also a lot of studies that show the stress hormones that like when you experience poverty or like lack of resources, cortisol is actually elevated in your body. And this begins even in childhood. There are a lot, if you're into researching this for a class, there's so many studies that actually show and trace what stress does, like how poverty actually negatively impacts your health, not because of even your environment, but because of what that creates in your body's response. Okay. Also, environmental classism and racism. In North Carolina, this is a big deal. And what I mean by environmental racism and classism is that in North Carolina, there were some of the biggest producers of hogs, pig farms. There's a lot of waste with industrial pig production, industrial pork. Those waste areas do not get put in the wealthy areas. Your air quality suffers. If y'all have ever driven by a pig farm, the water quality suffers because it runs off into your creeks and streams. Those are in low-income areas. The environmental impact of industry disproportionately affects poor people. And the intersection of that is it disproportionately affects people of color. Okay? So literally your body suffers. Housing, security deposits, moving to stay in budget. You found this great place to live, you're there, the landlord's like, yep, I'm gonna raise the rent 10%, I gotta move. Well, you don't get your security deposit back till after you already have to put a security deposit down somewhere else. And your security deposit might be higher because your credit score is lower or whatever. Like it's just, you keep moving to stay in budget and it's like expensive to move. Economies of scale, bulk buying versus immediate needs. You can save a lot of money if you go to Costco and spend a bunch of money on bulk stuff. Economies of scale. But if you are just getting by, like if you get paid, say you're a server in a restaurant, you got to use your tips to buy what you need that week. You can't afford to actually go save money by buying in bulk. So this is one of the ways this gets compounded. So I want to look at this, kind of take it down to college. This group, Hope Center for College Community Justice, studies this poverty in college students. If you ever research this for a class, this is they have tons of reports and studies. So they want to shift both the structural conditions and the mindsets that keep college students from succeeding. So they did this survey, and they specifically want to address food and housing at 2- and 4-year institutions, and 86,000 students participated in fall of 2018. Here's what they found. 45% of those 86,000 students were food insecure in the prior 30 days. Didn't have enough food, couldn't access the food, skipped a meal in order to afford gas to get to school, whatever. 56% of respondents were housing insecure, meaning at some point in that year, they didn't have a steady place to stay, they didn't have a safe place to stay, they were sleeping on a couch for a while, some kind of housing insecurity. They were behind on rent. 17% of respondents were homeless in the previous year. So back to that structural conditions and mindset. So here's some of the things that relate to y'all. Structural conditions for college students experiencing poverty. Educational scholarships and grants are often counted as income. When I was in grad school, I was like doing my taxes and I was like, this number on income's high. I did not make that much money. Well, half my tuition was paid for by my grad school and I had to pay taxes on that, even though that money never went into my account. It went straight to the school, but I somehow still got taxed on that. So this hits students pretty hard. That's a structural thing in our tax law. Okay? Few students are eligible for SNAP benefits. There's a lot, SNAP benefits, food stamps, EBT, to help folks get through. But a lot of times college students can't get access to them for various reasons. The requirements are complicated and it's hard to get an exception. FAFSA rarely grants financial independence to students under 24. This is really hard. I've had several students under the age of 24 that don't have any contact with their parents don't support them at all, they've been on their own since they were 18, And FAFSA still says, well, you can't access student aid unless we get your parents' financial information. These are structural issues that affect student finances, right? So mindset that this creates, that poverty is shameful, there's a stigma that somehow, like, it makes people feel like they've failed, or just eat more ramen, right? There's these structural issues, but just eat more ramen, you'll be fine, right? So what would it look like to shift our mindset? Some of these structural issues are out of our reach. We can work to change them and advocate to change them. You can write research papers on this, write your Congress people, try to make positive change, right? To change the structure. But also, what does it look like to change the conversation around poverty, where we start to value all work and all life wherever you are in this process? And not just laugh it off and tell someone to eat more ramen, Have elevated conversations with your awareness about some of the structural issues. Study them in your classes. Find resources in your community that, like students here have said, we're starting a food bank. They're hoping to change the mindset on what it means to be struggling here on campus, that it's okay, we can help each other out. We can redistribute some of these resources. There are people that want to help, they just don't know how. Well, we're going to have one way of doing that now. Because students are like, this shouldn't be happening. We should take care of each other. It shouldn't be embarrassing to ask for help. So that's what I hope that you can do. Some of this knowledge and awareness is just to think about, how could this be different, right? Study it a little bit. And if you've never studied Dr. King's work on economics, and you think you've heard everything, you think you know what he's about, take a different angle next time you do some studying, and see how that applies to poverty in America today. Thanks all for coming. What time are we at?
12:44.
Cool. Do y'all have any questions? We can take a couple questions. Comments? Doesn't have to be a question.
So what do you think the biggest problem facing Western support poverty challenged students? Food or rent?
Will you repeat the question?
Yeah. So Chuck Newberg asked, what do I think the what do you say, the most common or the biggest challenge for Western students are regarding poverty? My thought is that looks different for every student. So most of our students, like 40% according to this study, 40% of college students are living on the edge, right? And so it's not necessarily one of those categories, but the unexpected thing that happens, whatever that is for every different student. So it's a question of what is going to be, you get sick unexpectedly. And so that means you're late on your gas bill, like, you get a car repair that can't be taken care of right away. So you miss class, or you have to pick up extra shifts at work because you have to miss class, and how that snowballs. So I don't even know that it's like one particular issue, because most people who are figuring out how to handle their money, and are really tight, people are really good at making it work each month, but it's just barely there. I do know students skip meals to pay for books, stuff like that. So, and they don't even think that's a problem, because they're just like, I have to do this to get ahead. That's what I have to do. But to me, that's a problem. So I don't know, I feel like it's more of the unexpected thing that happens, and how that looks different for every student. So, yeah, that's how I see it happen. It's a different story whenever I hear from a student what they're struggling with. Good. Any other questions or comments? All right. Thank you all.
How many of you guys knew about the store that's opening this week?
Yeah, grand opening tomorrow, Tuesday, all the way down, past Faculty Row. Keep going past all the offices, past Stacy, past Chuck, all the way down, like you're going towards the gym kind of. And come check it out, 12:30. We'll be there Tuesday. And if you need help, there's signs on lots of doors. It's open every day for a couple hours. You can just drop in, or you can email on the signs on the door, Student Storehouse. Yeah. Cool. Thank you.